Today we are talking about Osiris and his return to the competitive meta. And in that context we'll also talk about how Osiris has changed and how he's played differently now and what that means for you if you're not playing at a competitive level. But let's start at the beginning. Towards the end of last season, we primarily saw any kind of guardians in solo lane. Mostly tankier ones that could just farm up very well, play very passively, and often utilized the support's blessing, the guardian's blessing, instead of going for warrior's blessing. That was a meta in which Osiris didn't necessarily shine. He was still okay for the most part. Back then Emilzy and I actually placed him in A, but he was by far not a top solo laner. While Osiris was able to bully those guardians out in lane, it didn't really matter much for them. Due to Guardian's Blessing, they still got all the benefits, they still got all the sustain, and they were just interested in passive farming anyways. So Osiris couldn't really do all that much and just wait for later stages of the game, and in those later stages, these Guardians would become a lot more impactful as they had those big teamfights, ultimates, and all that stuff going for them. Even the warriors that had a little bit of popularity were those who could make very big plays in teamfights, like for example Kukulkan, and Osiris is simply not designed for that primarily. He's not a horrible god to have in a teamfight, but he's most certainly not one of the top setup gods for his team. And then in Season 6, the meta drastically shifted. At the time I was actually a little bit surprised that we didn't see Osiris being played at all initially, but there are actually good reasons for that. We shifted more and more towards an aggressive solo lane again, with the new totem needing you to have a little bit of lane pressure to actually contest that, and just overall more aggressive playstyles being favored in solo. Especially gods like Achilles and King Arthur could also make decent impact after the solo lane phase, so it's not like they were exactly dependent on having those guardians in solo anymore in order to have the late game stages covered. And with those very present solo lane aggression warriors, certain other gods returned as well. We saw Camazotz as a counter for King Arthur because of his high sustain and his way of avoiding King Arthur's kit and not being killed so easily by him. And then we also saw Bellona, who has always been somewhat of a boxing presence in solo lane and was especially picked against Achilles. So generally we had a meta shaped around high damage gods that also had some sort of sustain, either directly built into their kit or by being able to proc either Berserker's Shield or Gladiator's Shield very easily. Now Osiris had also received multiple buffs since his highest popularity spikes. In Smite patch 5.11 he had gotten an increase to the base damage of Sickle Strike, and the cooldown of Lord of Afterlife was decreased from 90 to 75 seconds. In patch 6.1 this was furthered even more. Sickle Strike had its base damage increased again, from 60 to 260, which was initially 60 to 240, to now 70 to 270. And keep in mind, this is an ability with a 5-second cooldown, so it's very spammable. Additionally, Spirit Flail also had its base damage increased from 75 to 290 to 80 to 300, giving him even more aggression or clear depending on how you want to use it. So stat-wise, Osiris was really fine. There was one issue that he was facing though, and that was that King Arthur, who was popular in solo lane, wasn't exactly a good matchup for him. The problem with King Arthur versus Osiris is that Osiris wants to stick to his enemies as much as possible, and that's in order to do constant slap damage to them. You can't really do that with King Arthur. He has multiple ways to get away from Osiris slows, due to the fact that he has multiple dashes that are not affected by slows. And additionally, this also allows him to break out of Osiris' tether on a very regular basis, and you can't really apply that to most enemies. At the same time, through the extra movement that he gets through all his drag with basic attacks and his other abilities, it also is significantly harder to land the 2 or even the 1 on him than on most other targets in solo lane. And if that wasn't enough, then there's also the fact that King Arthur is just very good at sustaining with Gladiator's Shield, and that also makes it harder for Osiris to bully him out. But as it so happened with King Arthur, he got quite a few nerfs over the most recent patches, and this led to his popularity simply going down. Now, it's not like he's not valued anymore at all. He was still banned in quite a few games where Osiris was present, but he's not that ever-present pick anymore that you constantly have to keep in mind when planning your draft phase. And out of the 3 other matchups that you will see frequently, being Bellona, Achilles and Camazotz, none really is overwhelming for Osiris. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that Osiris dominates this fight. In fact, we have seen Osiris lose all of these matchups at some point, or at least games connected to those matchups. But at the same time, he is not in a massive disadvantage in any of those matchups either. He can trade very decently with Bellona depending on how he builds. He can trade decently with Achilles, the only problem being that Achilles has a little better ways of creating distance for the tether. And he can, once again, also trade decently with Camazotz as long as he plays the lane right. That also currently makes him a very safe pick with a lot of control over the draft. You simply are able to first pick Osiris if you want to, and then just see whatever the enemy comes up with, but there's nothing that you really need to be scared of at that point. And better yet, because Achilles and Bellona have shown to be relatively dominant solo picks, they are both getting nerfs. Before we get into those, a quick reminder, if you enjoyed the video so far, feel free to click the like button, it really helps me out. For Achilles, his basic attack range is decreased, the power percentage buff from Radiant Glory is reduced, and the physical power scaling on combat dodge is reduced, so he will take quite a bit of a hit, especially when it comes to his bully or his poke potential. For Bellona, the nerf is not as massive, it's a relatively minor nerf, with the healing from Scourge being decreased from 30 to 50 to 25 to 45, but it's still a nerf and Osiris is not getting one. As such, it makes sense to already get warmed up on Osiris in competitive a little bit, to have a feeling for how he performs right now, seeing as some of the other solos may drop down at least a little bit. But now for something that is really interesting and kind of changes a little bit how people look at Osiris for the most part. Deathwalker played him a little bit earlier in the season and he went for what I would say is a more traditional Osiris build. He started with Warrior's Blessing, into Berserker's Shield, into Warrior Tabai, and then Void Shield. This is what you would expect from Osiris. You use a lot of basic attacks and you have your cleave, so you're going to sustain through the Berserker Shield and you get a little bit of heal through Warrior's Blessing as well, of course. You're building Warrior Tabai because he's more of an attack cancel god than an attack spamming god, essentially, and therefore Warrior Tabai is better than Ninja Tabai. And then you're building Void Shield to get even more damage going for yourself through the protection reduction and through having a little bit of physical defense and health at the same time, as well as a little bit of power. Very, very logical and very much the standard path for Osiris ever since, basically. However, when Deathwalker played him again a month later, he completely overhauled that build, and that's the build that has been utilized ever since. You obviously still start with the Warrior's Blessing, you want to have that early sustain, it's just too good not to really, but after that, the build already differs. The start is always the same, it's always Warrior's Blessing with a round shield and then fill it up with pots, with health pots, so that you can sustain in lane a little bit. But the item that's primarily utilized here is Gladiator's Shield, which I find very interesting. Now, Gladiator's Shield is not a bad item, of course, but you would think that a god like Osiris utilizes Berserker's Shield better, simply because it gives you so much sustain and he has those AoE cleaves as well, and even with the reduced healing, it should be the item that you go for. But again, you have to keep in mind Osiris is more of a cancel warrior than somebody who consistently basic attacks, so he doesn't benefit that much from attack speed, which Berserker's Shield has a decent amount of. Instead, Gladiator's Shield has double the protection, meaning you will take a lot less poke damage earlier, and you only lose 5 power in return. And the other important part is that Gladiator's Shield has 10% cooldown reduction. And that is very interesting for Osiris because, as I said before, his abilities got gradual increases in damage over time. So while we still look at him as a basic attack god, essentially that slows enemies and then uses his basic attacks to do more damage, he is much more of an ability-based god than he used to be at this point. He does very high damage through his abilities alone. Obviously, you still want to chain them with basic attacks, but being able to use the abilities more often can be very impactful here, especially with his one which is so spammable in the first place. And the build continues down the same road. You have your Warrior's Blessing afterwards, as usual, but then you go into Breastplate of Valor instead of the Void Shield that was typically used. This way you have 30% cooldown reduction at this point, or even 40% if you have your blue buff, meaning you will be spamming your abilities over and over and over. You basically almost always slowing the enemy, of course, depending on how often you hit your one. But it makes for a very different experience with Osiris from how it used to be played. And it seems to be very effective so far. It's been working out in many games. There is also the option, the path that has been played by FineOK, to go into Gladiator's Shield and into Berserker's Shield. The problem is that you kind of delay the more high protection focused items that way. After that, the build is typically concluded with high defense item. Often you will see Hide of the Urchin, as it is such a good protection item, and you'll often see Only Hunter's Garb as well, because it gives him even more mitigation on top of the ridiculous amount of mitigation that he can already achieve. And in the same vein, there's also Spirit Robe that's often built later on. And this allows him to transition into the teamfight phase differently. He can soak up incredible amounts of damage that way, especially with 3 active. And he can also slow at least one target down very consistently throughout a team fight and really frustrate them and make sure that your team can catch up to them and, well, yeah, lock them down essentially. He's still not going to be as impactful in a team fight as other warriors are for the most part, but it helps him a lot when he has his abilities up so often and can have more impact that way. As we're also seeing buffs to healers at the moment, Osiris will probably stay in the meta for quite a while because his ultimate will also have an increased impact in the future. So while many of you probably never stopped playing Osiris on a ranked or casual level, I think it's an interesting new way of playing him that's worth trying out, focusing on the cooldown reduction instead of the previous just high slap damage. And with that, thank you guys very much for watching. If you're new to the channel, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell, it really helps me out. See you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth, out.